They don't fear you because you shout. They fear you because you don't. The ones who speak the loudest often hold the least power. But those who say nothing yet make others shift, question, hesitate, those are the ones who dominate without lifting a finger. Machiavelli understood the psychology of fear not as violence, but as silence, not as threats, but as presence. And when you master this law, you will no longer need to convince, argue, or react. They will submit not because you forced them, but because you made them imagine what you could do. A man who rules by words must always speak. A man who rules by fear rarely needs to. Machiavelli once wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But fear, when crafted correctly, never needs to be voiced. The most dangerous presence in the room is the one that doesn't explain itself. It doesn't clarify. It doesn't chase. It simply is. And in its silence, others begin to imagine. They fill the gaps with their own guilt, their own fears, their own history of betrayal. That's the genius of unspoken fear. It reflects them, not you. You become a mirror, and what they see in you is what they most fear in themselves. When you confront someone with aggression, you give them something to resist. You become visible, tangible, measurable. But when you remain composed, calculating, unreadable, you become myth. You become an idea that floats behind every decision they make. They don't know what you will do, and that is more powerful than anything you could ever say. Fear grows in silence, because silence makes the mind spiral. One unanswered look can crush louder than a threat. One sudden shift in energy can collapse an entire conversation. They ask themselves, what did you mean by that pause, that glance, that choice to leave the room? Fear is not built through violence. It is built through control. And the first thing you must control is yourself. Your reactions, your impulses, your tone. Never show desperation. Never try to prove your strength. The second you try to prove it, you've already lost it. Power is presence without permission. It's being calm when others expect rage. It's smiling when others expect retaliation. It's not reacting when they try to provoke. Because your silence tells them something worse than words ever could. You're not even threatened enough to respond. That, to the fragile ego, is unbearable. Machiavelli knew this. He knew that in politics, war, and court, the most terrifying figure was the one who didn't flinch, the one who could endure public attack without a blink, the one who, when insulted, looked at you not with anger but with knowing. That's when fear is born, not when you lash out, but when you don't need to. When they realize the war they started was never yours to fight, that you are operating on a plane where threats are obsolete, and their fear is self-inflicted. Power doesn't chase, it withdraws, and when it does, it becomes larger in their minds than it ever was in the room. Machiavelli understood that fear begins where certainty ends. When your enemies can no longer predict you, they can no longer control you. Distance is not weakness. It is the most effective psychological weapon in your arsenal. Because the mind fears what it cannot see, cannot hear, cannot interpret. When you remove your presence, you do not disappear. You multiply. They begin to imagine where you are, what you are thinking, what your silence means. And in that spiral, they lose control of their own narrative. Emotional distance is the first boundary of power. When you no longer offer access to your thoughts, your attention, or your energy, you become untouchable. You are no longer a person, they turn you into a possibility. That possibility is where fear lives. Because it has no shape, no limit, no timeline. It's not tied to logic. It is felt, not proven. And the ones who once underestimated you will start questioning every move they make in your absence. Did you notice the betrayal? Did you hear what they said? Are you planning something? Should they reach out first? The longer you remain silent, the louder these questions become. When you are present, they analyze your words. When you are gone, they analyze your silence. That is why the most strategic withdrawal is not passive, it's surgical. You pull away without explanation. You go quiet without warning. You stop responding, but you keep observing. You don't announce your boundaries, you enforce them, and the shift you create is immediate. They start to feel watched, even when you're not watching. They start to censor themselves, even when you're not listening. You've shifted the burden from your shoulders to theirs. You are no longer trying to be understood. Now, they are trying to understand you. And that reversal is where dominance begins. Machiavelli would say, never let your enemies think they've figured you out. Because once they do, they lose the fear. Predictability is comfort. Distance is discomfort. And people don't fear what makes sense. They fear what might happen. So pull back not with bitterness, but with intention. Disappear not as a retreat, but as a reminder. They must be reminded of what they lost when they lost your presence. Not through words, not through warnings, but through the unbearable silence that follows. Your absence becomes the echo that haunts their actions. The more they speak your name, the more power you have without ever returning. And when you do return, if you ever do, it will not be to explain. It will be to collect. They expect you to react. That's how they trap you. Every insult, every challenge, every poke is a test not of your strength, but of your control. Most people fail. They respond out of pride, ego, or the need to be understood. But Machiavelli knew the truth. Silence is the most violent response, because silence doesn't just deny them your words, it denies them power. When you refuse to respond, you take the oxygen out of the fire. Their anger has nothing to burn, their manipulation has nowhere to land, and the silence you give them is not peace, it is pressure. Because silence forces them to hear their own voice, it turns their words back onto themselves, and what they hear is insecurity, guilt, fear. That's why the strongest person in the room is the one who says the least. Not because they are afraid, but because they are choosing to let discomfort do the talking. Silence is not passive, it is deliberate. It creates space between you and them, and in that space, they begin to project. Was he offended? Is she planning something? Did they hear what I said? The longer you remain quiet, the louder their doubts become. Every pause becomes a puzzle. Every look becomes a message. Silence becomes your language, and only the intelligent can hear it. That is psychological warfare. Because when people don't know where they stand with you, they fear stepping wrong. They fear being exposed, being ignored, being erased. And that fear turns into submission. Not because you told them to kneel, but because they lowered themselves in the face of uncertainty. You must understand, people crave clarity. They want a reaction. They want to know you're affected. When you refuse to give it, you break their rhythm. You break their power. They can't control someone who doesn't flinch. They can't guilt someone who doesn't argue. They can't threaten someone who doesn't respond. Silence is not the absence of strength. It is the signal of mastery. Machiavelli warned that words often reveal more than they protect. That the one who speaks too much reveals their hand, their emotion, their fear. But the one who remains silent forces the others to reveal themselves. In your silence, people expose their motives. They fill in the gaps. They betray their own thoughts trying to read yours. And when they finally break, when they finally speak just to silence the tension, they always reveal more than they intended. That is when you win quietly, not with a speech, not with a scream, but with the devastating weight of saying nothing at all. Because silence is a mirror, and some people cannot bear to face what it reflects. Fear is most effective when it's rooted in truth, but concealed in silence. Machiavelli understood that the most dangerous person is not the one who attacks, but the one who observes. Most people are too loud to be lethal. They telegraph their every move, spill their emotions, and expose their strategy before the game even begins. But the real threat is the one sitting quietly, learning. When you study someone, truly study them, You will know exactly where they bleed, what they fear, what they hide, what they pretend to be. But here's the rule. You never let them know you know. That is the trap. Because once they know you've seen through them, they become defensive, alert, prepared. But if you say nothing, if you pretend you are still unsure, you keep them vulnerable. Your silence becomes the container of their secrets. And nothing terrifies a manipulator more than being understood by someone who remains quiet. You let them keep talking, keep revealing, keep thinking they're in control. All the while, you are collecting data, their patterns, their language, their insecurities. This is not for revenge, it is for precision. You are not reacting emotionally, you are building the exact weapon that will one day dismantle them, if necessary, with a single move. That is what Machiavelli called strategic cruelty. Not cruelty in action, but in patience. A type of cold foresight that turns information into silent leverage. When you know what they fear but never speak of it, they feel it in your presence. They sense it in your calm. They panic, trying to figure out what you've seen. And you say nothing. You smile. You watch. That is how fear spreads, not from what is said, but from what is suspected. Most people have skeletons. Most people wear masks. And when someone walks in who can see right through both, they feel naked, exposed, powerless. You don't need to threaten them. You don't even need to correct them. You simply need to stay silent long enough for them to reveal everything. Then, when the time is right, when they try to move against you, when they believe you are weak, you act. But not emotionally, not loudly. You act with the precision of someone who's already played this game in their mind 100 times. Because you were never confused, you were never caught off guard, you were always just watching. Machiavelli believed control belongs to the one who knows more and says less. So let them talk, let them lie, let them believe they've won. Meanwhile, you observe, you collect, you wait. Because once you know their fear, you own the battlefield, even if you never step foot on it. You don't always need to act. You only need them to believe you might. That belief alone, unconfirmed, unexplained, can unravel even the most confident enemy. Machiavelli knew that fear doesn't always have to come directly from your mouth. Sometimes, the most powerful move is to say nothing and let the whispers speak for you. Rumors are weapons made by other people's imaginations, and the brilliance of a rumor is that once it starts, you don't have to lift a finger. It spreads by fear, by assumption, by insecurity. One subtle shift in how you look at someone, one unexpected disappearance, one calm exit from a room, and suddenly they're talking, not because you made a threat, but because you left space for them to invent one. That space is where the virus of uncertainty breeds, and if you cultivate the right kind of silence, people will fill it with their own worst fears. You see, power doesn't always move. Sometimes it hovers quiet and unexplainable. That's what gets inside their head, because the most paranoid enemies are the ones who can't tell if they're being hunted or ignored. And the ones who talk too much will start spreading stories to feel in control. You don't deny it. You don't confirm it. You just let the rumor live, because while they're chasing shadows, they're not watching your hands, and that gives you time, space, and control. In every social circle, in every hierarchy, fear travels faster than truth. People would rather believe a dangerous mystery than a harmless reality. Machiavelli understood that fear amplified through silence can do what threats cannot. It lasts. It grows in rooms you've never entered. It makes enemies turn against themselves. It makes allies cautious. It makes your presence larger than your actual influence. And that is the key. You never speak about your intentions. You never clarify the rumors. Let them wonder. Let them connect the dots in a way that traps them in their own imagination. That imagination becomes your greatest ally, because no enemy prepares calmly when they believe you've already started the war. They panic, they overshare, they form alliances out of desperation, and the more they try to protect themselves from a threat that hasn't come, the more they destroy their own position. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't make a move. You didn't even start the fire. You just let the wind blow. And they burned themselves trying to put out flames that weren't even real. That's Machiavelli's deeper art, not domination by force, but fear by suggestion. No fingerprints, no evidence, just a presence so unsettling, so mysterious, that people fear what you could do more than what you've done. And in the end, they defeat themselves while you remain untouched. Most people are not afraid of cruelty, they're afraid of indifference. Cruelty at least acknowledges the other person. It says, "You mattered enough for me to strike." But indifference? Indifference says, "You're irrelevant." And that breaks something deeper. Machiavelli understood that emotional control is the root of unshakable power. When others cannot trigger you, they cannot own you. When they try to provoke, and you respond with calm, they begin to feel exposed, desperate, powerless. It is not your anger they fear, it's your lack of it. Because the one who can remain still in chaos signals a level of internal strength that few possess. That stillness makes them question what you know, what you're planning, what you've already seen. Emotional indifference is not coldness for its own sake. It is control. It is restraint. It is the quiet refusal to give them access to your reactions. That refusal drives them mad, because people don't attack what they don't think they can move. They test you to see if you are emotionally alive, emotionally vulnerable. If you are, they will manipulate you. If you're not, they will fear you. Imagine someone tries to insult you. Most people defend themselves, get angry, retaliate. But what happens when you simply don't care? When you look at them, not with rage, but with absolute stillness? They become unsettled, because their words didn't land, their weapon had no effect, and now they feel small. You didn't even flinch. That's when the tables turn. Because your indifference says more than any insult ever could. It says, "You don't matter enough to disturb me." And nothing makes a person feel weaker than realizing their power over you was imagined. Machiavelli knew that emotional detachment isn't numbness. It's clarity. You still feel, but you don't show it. You choose your responses like a weapon, not a reflex. And that choice gives you an edge over everyone who lives on impulse. When you remain indifferent to praise, to criticism, to chaos, you become the one thing no enemy can predict. A storm rages, and you sip your drink. A betrayal surfaces, and you straighten your collar. That calm burns louder than any reaction, because it sends a message: I'm not here to fight, I'm here to outlast. Indifference makes you immune, and immunity is terrifying to the emotionally volatile. They cannot guilt you, they cannot seduce you, they cannot scare you. And when someone realizes they have no control over your emotions, they begin to retreat, not out of defeat, but out of confusion. Because if they can't move your heart, they can't find your weakness. And if they can't find your weakness, they will start to believe you don't have one. That belief is power, silent, cold, final. Predictability is comfort, and comfort is the enemy of fear. Machiavelli understood that when people can predict your next move, they stop respecting it. They adjust, they prepare, they counter, but when they cannot read you, when your actions follow no familiar rhythm, they begin to fear what's coming, not because of its strength, but because of its uncertainty. To be feared without threats, you must become unpredictable, not reckless, not chaotic, just unreadable. One day, you respond with silence, the next, with a smile, the day after, with complete withdrawal. Your moves must disrupt their rhythm, because fear lives in the gap between what they expect and what you actually do. The more they try to map your behavior and fail, the more they begin to doubt themselves, and that doubt is poison. It eats away at their confidence. They flinch before speaking, they hesitate before acting, because they no longer know who they're dealing with. You've made yourself impossible to define, and that makes you dangerous. When you're consistent, you're manageable. When you're unpredictable, you're a storm, and storms aren't fought, they're avoided. That's the power you're building, not power that demands attention, but power that controls how others move around you. You must become the exception to their assumptions. When they think you'll attack, you vanish. When they expect kindness, you become cold. When they anticipate silence, you speak, but not to please, not to explain, only to disorient. This isn't manipulation, it's mastery. The world trains people to expect patterns. Break them, keep them guessing, keep them adjusting. Make it exhausting for anyone to try and understand your intentions. That exhaustion leads to fear, because people don't fear what they understand. They fear what they can't prepare for. That's why Machiavelli never advised constant aggression. It becomes predictable. He preferred the slow build, the quiet pause, the unexpected strike. Power is not just in the action, it's in the timing. And timing is everything when your goal is to disturb without speaking. Unpredictability works because it forces them to pay attention. It pulls their focus, their thoughts, their energy toward you, even when you're not present, even when you've said nothing. You live in the back of their mind like a question they can't answer, and that question haunts them. What will you do next? Will you act? Will you retaliate? Or are you already 10 steps ahead? That's how you win without a fight, not by being the loudest or the most aggressive, but by becoming the variable they can't solve. When people fear your unpredictability, they start to avoid confrontation altogether. They tread lightly. They speak in careful tones. They choose peace, not because you forced it, but because they've seen what happens when you don't follow the script. You are not just playing the game. You're rewriting the rules mid-match. And that, without a word, is enough to make anyone afraid to challenge you again. Your name should enter the room before you do. That was Machiavelli's quiet command to anyone who sought real power. Because fear doesn't start with confrontation, it starts with reputation. What people think you are capable of is far more effective than what you actually do. That illusion, if crafted properly, becomes armor. You don't need to constantly prove yourself when your presence already carries the weight of past precision. And the best reputations aren't built on chaos. They're built on control, on a few carefully chosen moments that echo longer than any speech ever could. You don't need to show your strength often. In fact, you shouldn't. The more rare your reaction, the more dangerous it appears. One cold move, one calculated silence, one calm but ruthless decision. These are the moments that define how they speak your name when you're not around. Reputation is not noise, it's memory. It's the collection of moments where you responded differently than everyone else. When others collapsed under pressure, you stood still. When they begged for clarity, you offered none. When betrayal came, you didn't scream, you vanished. These things are remembered, and over time, they become legend. People begin to say your name with caution. They warn others not to cross you, not because they've seen what you'll do, but because they've heard. That's the psychology of fear. Once your reputation becomes larger than your presence, you gain power in places you've never even stepped foot in. Your absence becomes a type of presence. People adjust their behavior, not when you're watching, but when they only think you might be. And that's the highest level of control. You do not need to dominate every conversation. You do not need to constantly defend yourself. You only need to act with such intentionality that each action lives longer than the moment. Machiavelli knew that brutality used too often loses its edge. But brutality used once, in silence, with precision, becomes myth. The goal is not to be feared for being loud. It is to be feared for being effective. And effectiveness is remembered. The world respects restraint more than rage, because restraint hints at a power that hasn't yet been unleashed, and that hint becomes your legend. So let others speak. Let them shout, posture, boast. You do not need to match them. You need only to remind them, quietly, that your silence has a history, that your calm once dismantled an enemy, that your smile once came before someone disappeared. Reputation does the work for you. It walks ahead of you, whispers in rooms you'll never enter, protects you from wars you'll never have to fight. And once that reputation is built, you'll find that your enemies stop trying to provoke you, not because they've grown wiser, but because they've learned what happens when they do. Kindness, when used with precision, is more terrifying than cruelty. Because people expect cruelty, they know how to brace for it, defend against it, label it as evil, and move on. But kindness, especially from someone known for silence, control, and coldness, confuses them. Machiavelli understood that unpredictability is the root of power, and there is no greater disorientation than mercy from a source they feared. When you act with warmth in moments they expect war, you pull the ground out from beneath them. Their script falls apart. Their rehearsed defenses become useless. They expected retaliation and received patience. They expected distance and received eye contact. That contradiction leaves them exposed in a way cruelty never could. Because cruelty is loud, but kindness is quiet. And in that quiet, they are left alone with their guilt, their paranoia, their imagination. They wonder what your kindness means. Is it real? Is it manipulation? Is it the setup before a larger fall? They analyze your tone, your timing, your posture, and what they don't understand, they begin to fear. That's the advantage. You are not being soft, you are being strategic. You are not forgiving them, you are feeding their confusion. True fear doesn't come from pain, it comes from the unknown. And nothing is more unknowable than a person who can choose to show compassion when vengeance was deserved. That level of control is rare. That level of power is silent. When you show kindness in moments where others would scream, you signal that you are not like them. You are something else. Something measured. Something they cannot provoke or predict. That image burns deeper than any threat. It leaves them watching their own back, waiting for a consequence that may never come. Because in your silence and mercy, they feel more judgment than any punishment could deliver. Kindness becomes a mirror, and if they are the kind of person who betrayed you, lied to you, tried to use you, they cannot stand to see themselves in that reflection. They cannot accept generosity from the one they tried to destroy. So they spiral. They either try to make it right, or they run. Either way, you win. Because you did not react, you chose. And that choice, that ability to remain unmoved yet benevolent, will haunt them. Machiavelli's law was simple. Confuse them, and you control them. Give them silence when they expect noise. Give them patience when they expect revenge. Give them nothing when they demand closure. And when it's least expected, offer kindness. Not because they deserve it, but because it leaves them questioning who you are and what you want. That question grows louder than any scream. It lingers in every room they enter. It speaks when you do not. And in time, they will fear you not because you hurt them, but because you didn't. Power is not just about what you do, it's about how it looks while you're doing it. In a world ruled by perception, the optics of control matter more than control itself. Machiavelli understood that people don't respond to truth, they respond to the image of truth. You can lose a battle and still look composed. You can win a war and still appear humble. And it is that appearance, that carefully designed illusion, that creates long-term influence. If people believe you are always in control, they will act accordingly, even when they shouldn't. That belief becomes your shield, your shadow, your echo. It follows you into every room and speaks before you do. That is the art, not just winning, but looking like you meant to win all along. Looking like nothing surprised you, like every outcome served your larger plan. The world is addicted to signals. Signals of confidence, indifference, precision. And when your behavior communicates these things, you don't need to explain yourself. You never justify. You never defend. You move in a way that says, this was inevitable. That posture disturbs your enemies more than any threat ever could, because it removes their illusion of control. They realize they never had the upper hand. Not because you said so, but because your calm says it for you. When you suffer, suffer in silence. When you win, win with grace. When you plan, do it behind closed doors. Then, when you emerge, let your actions be wrapped in mystery. Let them wonder how you pulled it off. Let them see the result without understanding the process. That gap between result and explanation is where fear grows. If people cannot trace your logic, they will assume you're smarter than you are. If they cannot predict your moves, they will assume you're playing a deeper game. And they will start to behave accordingly, cautiously, quietly, submissively. You don't need to convince them you're powerful. You need only to ensure they never see you lose control. Even when things fall apart, especially when things fall apart, you maintain the image. That image becomes legend. Machiavelli warned that a prince must appear virtuous, even if he is not. The same applies to power. You must appear in control, even when you are adjusting. You must look unbothered, even when you are calculating. The image is everything, because perception does not need evidence. It only needs consistency. So choose what you want to be seen as, and then live it, breathe it, perform it. Let others tell the story. Let others spread the myth. You do not speak for yourself. The optics speak louder, and over time, that illusion becomes reality. Not because it's true, but because they believed it long enough to make it so. Fear does not always come from you. Sometimes it's already buried inside them. Machiavelli understood that the most efficient form of control is not about force, it's about reflection. When you become a mirror, you force people to confront the parts of themselves they've spent years hiding. You don't need to raise your voice or make accusations. You simply exist with enough stillness, enough presence, that their own guilt begins to speak louder than anything you could say. And that is the deepest fear: being seen, truly seen. Not the version they present to the world, not the persona they use to hide their insecurities, but the raw, flawed, manipulative, weak version they try to bury. When they stand in front of someone who sees through the act, their fear becomes internal. They start to behave nervously, not because you did anything, but because you didn't. You didn't play into their drama. You didn't explain yourself. You didn't try to prove them wrong. You just observed, and that unnerves them. Because silence in the face of manipulation is not passivity, it's power. It says, I see you, I know you, and I don't need to tell you what you already fear about yourself. That is when they spiral. Because now, they're not fighting you, they're fighting their own reflection. You are not the villain in their story. You are the consequence. You are what happens when the mask slips, and they're met not with rage or revenge, but with unwavering awareness. The most powerful people do not expose others with words. They simply become too calm, too clear, too unaffected. And in that clarity, everything fake begins to collapse. The liar stumbles, the insecure grow louder, the manipulative try harder, all because your presence forces them to reckon with themselves. Machiavelli would say, do not confront a man's actions. Confront his nature, quietly. And the way you do that is by standing firm in your energy. No defense, no reaction, no indulgence. Let them reveal themselves through the discomfort of being seen. Let them unravel without you lifting a hand. Because the truth is, most people are running from something. A regret, a secret, a weakness. And when they encounter someone who cannot be emotionally swayed, who does not need to react, who seems to already know, they panic, not because of what you might do, but because of what they've already done. You become the shadow of their own shame, the silent reminder that no lie lasts forever. And that type of fear is the most enduring, because it doesn't rely on threats or force. It relies on their own mind turning against itself. And you remain still, watching, unshaken, letting the mirror do the work. The most powerful victories are the ones no one sees. No confrontation, no explosion, no final word, just silence and collapse. Machiavelli understood that the ultimate form of power is influence without movement. You do not chase, you do not argue, you do not correct. You simply let time do what force cannot. When fear is planted correctly, it grows on its own. The enemy begins to question, not just you, but themselves. Their own actions start to haunt them. Their decisions turn against them. And all of it happens while you say nothing. This is how you win without lifting a hand. Not through dominance, but through detachment. Not by proving your strength, but by refusing to react. Because reaction is the currency of control, and you spend nothing. You become the ghost in the room, the presence they can't explain, the weight they feel, even when you're gone. And in that absence, they begin to deteriorate. Their ego, once inflated by your silence, starts to eat itself. They overanalyze, they reach out, they try to provoke, but you've moved beyond them. You are no longer fighting, you are observing. Let them run in circles trying to fix what they broke. Let them invent reasons, rewrite history, seek closure that will never come. You owe them nothing. That is the final blow. Not revenge, not rage, but irrelevance. And it is in that irrelevance where fear thrives. Because you're no longer part of the game, they're just playing with your shadow. They think you're watching. They think you're planning. They think you care. And all the while, they are exhausting themselves in a war you've already exited. That is the true lesson. Fear that grows without confrontation is impossible to kill, because there is nothing to strike, no opponent to fight, just a presence that lingers in their mind, infecting every move, every thought, every word. You gave them nothing, and they made a monster out of it. That is what Machiavelli meant when he said that power often belongs to the one who does less, not more. It is not always about action, it's about consequence. Let them crumble under the weight of their own paranoia. Let them chase answers to questions you never asked. And when they finally fall, when the silence has done what speeches never could, you will still be standing untouched, unchanged, and unreadable. That is victory. Not because they lost, but because you never had to play. You don't need to be seen to be felt. That's the final truth Machiavelli understood better than anyone. When fear is crafted correctly, your presence becomes a shadow they cannot escape. Even in your absence, you shape the room. People speak differently when they think you might be listening. They move carefully, calculate more, retreat faster. And all of this happens without a single threat, without a single raised voice. Because true fear is not external, it's internal. You don't plant it with your hands. You grow it in their mind. Over time, you become more than a person. You become a possibility, a question that never gets answered, a door that never quite shuts. They start to feel you in places you've never stepped into. You become the invisible ceiling to their ambition, the silence between their words, the reason they sleep less and explain more. That's the end game. Not domination, not destruction, but quiet control. You are no longer reacting. You are not even responding. You are simply there. Not in body, but in consequence. Every move they make is now shaped by the fear of what you could do. And what you could do always outweighs what you actually would. Because potential, especially dangerous potential, is heavier than proof. A threat ends, a possibility doesn't. That's why you leave some things unanswered. That's why you never explain your full logic. That's why you disappear without closure. It's not cruelty, it's architecture. You're building a psychological structure they must walk through every time they think of you. And it never collapses. They don't remember what you said. They remember what they felt when you walked in, when you stared without blinking, when you stayed calm while others broke, when you smiled and walked away instead of striking back. Those are the moments that last, not because they were loud, but because they were too silent to forget. In the end, you become the fear they created for themselves. You become the consequence they imagined but never saw. And that is the kind of power that doesn't fade, it grows, quietly, permanently. Because when someone can feel you in your absence, when they shape their future around your silence, you have already won. You are no longer just a name. You are a shadow, a law, a presence stitched into their every move. No throne, no crown, just gravity. And they obey not because you told them to, but because they can no longer remember how it felt to move without you. That is Machiavelli's final lesson. That when you master the psychology of fear, you don't need to raise your voice. You don't even need to be there. You are the echo they can't silence, and the shadow they can never outrun. If this spoke to something buried deep inside you, good. That means you're waking up. The game was never fair, but it was always winnable for those who understood power without performance. So now you know. Let them chase approval. Let them beg to be liked. You will move differently. You will move silently, and they will feel it. If you're ready to master the invisible game, subscribe, watch what's next, and remember, fear is not forced, it is earned, and then unleashed without a word.